Okay, everyone, welcome. Welcome to SPAU 25 and welcome to this talk on Putin's war and Germany's new foreign policy. My name is Wolfgang Wagner. I'm a professor of international security at the Freie Universität Amsterdam. And this is a event that is sponsored partly by the Center for European Studies at my university with the wonderful acronym of WISES, and the Deutschland Institute, Institute for German Studies at the UFA. What brings us together is a common interest in Germany's role in Europe and its foreign policy. And of course, this is an obviously interesting moment to discuss whether and to what extent Germany is orchestrating any response to Putin's war in Ukraine. Some 20 years ago, I was a doctoral student in Frankfurt with Gunther Hellmann. So it's a particular pleasure for me to welcome him to Amsterdam and to introduce him. Gunther has worked on a couple of topics in international relations, on NATO, on transatlantic relations, on international security. But I think the center of gravity has been German foreign policy. So there has been a continuous stream of books and articles and chapters, op-eds, and more recently, I think, tweets as well on different aspects of German foreign policy. And what characterizes Gunther's work is that he has a very sharp eye for seemingly less important shifts in the public discourse, the introduction of new terms, the reinterpretation of existing terms such as Verantwortung, responsibility, or Sonderweg, and to extrapolate and discuss the broader ramifications of these shifts in the public discourse for Germany's role in Europe and beyond, with, I think it's fair to say, with particular concern for the fragility of this order of which Germany has been a part. So I think Gunther is the perfect speaker on Germany's foreign policy, and I'm really happy that there is such a good crowd. I understand that there are students from the program in Deutschland Studies from UFA, so welcome to you especially. But I also see students from the FU and of course a broader audience. Very nice to see that there is an interest in German foreign policy. And without further ado, I would give the floor to Gunther Hellmann, who will talk for about 30, 40 minutes, something like this. And then we'll have time for questions from the audience. Thanks so much for coming to Amsterdam, Gunther, and the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Wolfgang. Is this working? Thank you very much, Wolfgang, for inviting me back to Ton and others, the co-organizers here of this event today, to be here in Amsterdam. I've been here, I think, twice or three times for talks in different contexts. And I don't need to tell you that Amsterdam is a nice place to come to as often as one can. So thank you very much for getting me here. What I will try to do, and the title tells that already, is that I will, with fairly broad brushes, try to paint a picture where Germany is located in this fragile, as Wolfgang, I think, rightly said, fragile world, increasingly fragile world, crisis-ridden world at this point in time. And I will try to do this also in a broader historical context in terms of what these watershed moments mean for Germany and in particular what they mean for the rest of Europe. Because, of course, whenever Germany comes up, German foreign policy, in the context of the last, say, 150 years or so, there's instant repercussions between what Germany does and what Europe suffers or enjoys as a result. So looking initially, briefly, at these watershed moments in a broader history just helps, I think, I hope at least, to shed some light as to how the current watershed moment, the Zeitenwende, might figure in the broader picture. And I will start with a 1870, 1871, the war between Prussia and France. And of course, the victory for Prussia and how that changed the landscape of Europe. The coronation of the Kaiser in Versailles with all the humiliating effects for the French and what that meant for the rest of Europe. I've taken a quote from then Prime Minister Disraeli, the British Prime Minister, who I think put it fairly succinctly in terms of what he called a political revolution, Germany's victory over France, that this is a German revolution, a greater political event than the French Revolution of last century. You have a new world, Disraeli said, new influences at work. The balance of power in Europe has been entirely destroyed, and the country which suffers most and feels the effects of this great change most is England. I mean, you all realize England was probably the biggest, greatest power in the European concert of powers at that point in time. And from that angle, from the island, of course, Disraeli is saying Prussia's victory and the fact that the Kaiserreich was formed shattered the balance of power in Europe for good. Of course, ever since then, German foreign policy has been a critical factor in European calculations. And as we will see, I mean, jumping in big steps, of course, in order to look at such watershed moments, what they meant for Germany. I mean, the formation of the Kaiserreich as a result of the war against France in 70-71. But then, of course, with the differences, Bismarck's success in handling a delicate system of power and Wilhelm's disastrous failure in following up and managing those power relations, great power relations, of course, ended in World War I. Which I think is a second major watershed when you want to look at German foreign policy, how it evolved over times. Always you see a major interaction between German foreign policy on the one hand and certain structural configurations in the European balance of power, both in terms of, we'll come to that in a few minutes, in terms of war and peace issues, but also in terms of how countries were relating to each other in certain alliance arrangements. Article 231 from the Treaty of Versailles succinctly puts in a few phrases what the end of the war, Germany's defeat, meant for Germany and the rest of Europe at that point in time. The article reads, "The Allied and the associated governments affirm, and Germany accepts, the responsibility of Germany and her allies for causing all the loss and damage to which the Allied and associated governments and their nationals have been subjected as a consequence of a war imposed upon them by the aggression of Germany and her allies." This is the Kriegsschuld, which was imposed, so to say, in treaty form on the Germans in Versailles, same location as 1871. And of course, initially signaled also that as a result of World War I, how Germany's place occupied in part and imposed with heavy reparations, that Germany's place in Europe had fundamentally changed as a result of that outcome. Stresemann and others tried to establish Germany in a novel and also peaceful fashion, but given the fact that also power relations in the European concert at that point in time were fraught with nationalistic and also against the background of the world economic recession, difficult economic times, made it quite difficult to come to terms in a fashion that was possible after World War II. You have, of course, then the most dramatic break in Germany's history after World War II, Stunde Null, 0 hour, as some historians name that particular period, a total defeat, total occupation of all of Germany, division of the country, and that all in the context, of course, in a successively developing bipolar confrontation between two superpowers on the flanks of Europe, Russia, Soviet Union, and the United States, which imposed a different type of order on the European situation, with Germany, a divided Germany, at its center. Germany, after World War II, had to reinvent itself from scratch, so to say. In the long 150 years history of German foreign policy that I'm trying to sketch very briefly here, this was, of course, the deepest cut and break. I have chosen a quote from Martin Sabro, a historian, and I just used the German version here, where he's saying essentially the experience that German society went through was one that the order of time itself had just lost any meaning as far as past, present, and future is concerned. And I think that pretty much sums up what what 0 hour, Stunde Null, actually meant. Lost any type of meaning as far as the history of Germany at that point in time was concerned. Difficult to imagine any aspirable future for Germany, and the present, of course, after 1945, that was also pretty difficult to grapple with. Again, these are big jumps, only highlights in terms of just looking at watershed moments when it comes to German foreign policy. And we're jumping to 1990 right away from there. So you have the end of World War II, the evolving bipolar structure, German division at the center, and you have then 40 years, essentially, of the Cold War bipolar constellation shaping European relations with Germany at its center, divided Germany. 1989, 1990 brings the possibility of Germany actually reuniting. And with a lot of luck and skill, diplomatic skill on the part of many involved observers and politicians, this indeed succeeded. I mean, I don't want to go into detail here, but just in terms of realizing that already at that point in time, and there are lots of quotes from Margaret Thatcher, for instance, during the negotiations of the 2+4 treaty, how the Brits, the conservatives in particular, were worried about a Fourth Reich coming in the form of united Germany, that was a critical point in Europe's development, of course, but it was also critical in Germany's own development, because unification ended, so to say, the three main tasks that the Federal Republic, West Germany, had set for itself. Unity in peace and freedom. Einheit in Friede und Freiheit. That was the short formula that German politicians used to operate with when they were talking about the overarching German ambitions during the Federal Republic's 40 years of existence. And that, in a moment of a year, you might say, had been achieved. Unity in peace with all the partners and preserving the freedom that West Germany had enjoyed for the past 4 decades. Hans-Dietrich Genscher, and that is the quote that I chose to mark that watershed moment, when he gave a declaration in the German Bundestag shortly before the 2+4 treaty was signed, said, Germany wants to provide a policy of the good example, and the Politik des guten Beispiels. We as Germans have more weight. He didn't use power, but the more weight, größeres Gewicht, that's the German substitute, you might say, for power. We know that the people of Europe ask themselves how the Germans will use that greater weight. But for us, the only answer that can be is we are not seeking more power, but we will be conscious of the greater responsibility that Germany has. Giving a policy, providing a policy of the good example, that was the main line that Germans started with at that point. Jumping right away to the present now, in this larger historical picture, Olaf Scholz, towards the end of February of this year, gave that memorable speech in the German Bundestag, where he used the concept of a watershed moment himself. And what I think is interesting about that quote is how he placed it. The watershed he was referring to, of course, was Putin's invasion in Ukraine. A watershed that, in Olaf Scholz's words, meant that the world afterwards will no longer be the same as the world before. The issue at the heart, and I'm quoting him here, the issue at the heart of this is whether power is allowed to prevail over the law, whether we permit Putin to turn back the clock to the 19th century and the age of great powers, or whether we have it in us to keep warmongers like Putin in check. So what you see here is the Social Democrat, Olaf Scholz, frames the issue as one of power or law, war and peace, and that warmongers, as he calls Putin in this context, have to be stopped. We as Europeans, Germans, have to stand up, militarily of course, and push that kind of outright violence back. What was more significant, besides these kinds of words, was of course that the coalition government of the Greens, the SPD, and the Free Democrats also decided at that point in time, it was formally legislatively finalized in the subsequent weeks, that an extra 100 billion euros would have to be spent on the Bundeswehr and the military infrastructure, the disastrous infrastructure that the Bundeswehr was operating with. 100 billion is about 2 times an annual budget, defense budget, which is a significant amount. And it was the Social Democrat, Olaf Scholz, who was making that kind of commitment after having talked to his coalition partners that Germany needed to stand up and move forward. I've been using these brief highlights to just show that the current event, the current watershed moment is, first of all, not as significant as a few of the past ones. And moreover, it is also different in the sense that what Scholz describes as a watershed moment today is in many ways perceived by Germans as something that is forced on us. Outside events, unacceptable violence, something that has destroyed a European order needs to be countered in contrast to all those prior moments, I mean, with the exception of 1990, of course, where Germany tried to change a situation, political structures in the European context by force. So Germany now being in a situation where it is called upon to lead, including militarily, and is hesitating in many ways, hesitating too much, as we'll see, by many of our allies, to take a leadership role, including in the military field. So in that sense, Ukraine, the invasion, the war that Putin launched against that country, was a clarifying moment. After quite a few developments that have been building up over the preceding years, yet, and this is one of my arguments that I wanted to lay out today, I would say the watershed moment has been building for some time longer. A bit of self-advertisement here. I published a piece in 2017, basically trying to look at where Germany, that was right before the elections in 2017, the Bundestag elections, where I was trying to look at where Germany stood in terms of its foreign policy, what kinds of developments had shaped the environment up until that point in time, and what would result. And at that point, I used the word Zeitenwende in order to describe what had happened in the preceding 3 years, roughly 2.5 years. And this is the kind of argument that I developed and I think still sticks today. In order to properly assess what the Zeitenwende means, one has to go back to a series of events, critical events from a German perspective in particular, which will help to understand what has actually been building for some time. As we call it in German, Westintegration und Ostkooperation, Ostpolitik, that is integration and cooperation with key Western partners on the one hand, and Detente, Entspannung with our Eastern partners. Those were the 3 key pillars. 3 because, of course, on the Western side you had, as far as the defense dimension is concerned, NATO and the US and Canada, including the European allies. You had the European Union, as it is called today, as the key economic integration project that binds these then Western European countries together. These were the essential 2 pillars of German foreign policy for the post-World War II situation. With Willy Brandt in the early 70s, Ostpolitik was added. And Ostpolitik in that sense was a critical addition because it, as Herbert Wehner at some point said, it helped Germany not just to stand on one leg, but to walk east and west. Not just standing in the west, deeply integrated, but moving ahead. In the period between 2014 and 16, I'm arguing all these 3 pillars were shattered significantly. That is, the foundation in many ways of German foreign policy had been undermined critically in a very short period of time in all essential dimensions. 2014, of course, and this is in terms of the chronology, the order that I'm presenting it, but of course in terms of significance, it's the other way around. 2014, of course, the first invasion in first Crimea, annexation, and then in eastern Ukraine, where it became clear instantly, and I was actually looking at a quote from Angela Merkel's speech in I think it was March or April 2014, where she was using a similar language than Scholz in his watershed address, where it had become clear finally, and I had been experiencing Steinmeier, then foreign minister in Berlin several times, also in smaller circles, where he was saying this event had shattered his own perception as to what Russia, Putin, and the Russian government actually want. He had been pushing for a modernization partnership since about 2011, when he was first foreign minister. The SPD in particular, but not only the SPD, had been trying to build a kind of cooperative relationship in order to add to the integration with Western European partners in order to just keep Germany balanced between East and West. Putin's annexation of Crimea and the occupation of parts of eastern Ukraine shattered that. Brexit shattered, in many ways, the key, a critical project that Germany has been working on with European partners since World War II, which is the understanding and expectation that European integration can only move forward. More members, deeper integration. deepening and widening. That was the rationale that drove beliefs in Germany and everywhere else in many European capitals and societies that ever closer European Union was an irreversible process, historically irreversible. Brexit ended that in the summer of 2016. A dramatic experience that a country of that significance wanted to actually leave the European Union. So in many ways, the very project of the European integration project had been put in question. And most significantly, only a few months later, when Donald Trump became US president, with all what would follow after his election, shattered the most deeply held and significant basis of post-war German integration. The belief and conviction that our US allies can be trusted to come to our defense and that they are a reliable partner. You probably have some memories as to how Trump, not only Germans, but in particular Germans, how he dressed and attacked them. That was a traumatic experience in many ways for Germans. So I'm arguing that when we come to today and observe Olaf Scholz's Zeitenwende, this is a moment that had been building both in terms of events affecting how Germany acts and the way that German political elites, foreign policy decision makers, over time, slowly and with some hesitation, tried to come to grips with the fact that we can no longer just stand back and leave leadership roles in a European context to others, the US as far as defense is concerned, and maybe France and Britain in terms of European partners, but that we as Germans had to come in. Ukraine 2022, Russia's occupation, war against Ukraine, is in that sense clarifying because it has, so to say, put an end to the image of Europe sticking in a, well, sort of post-World War II Kantian freedom environment where, of course, conflicts between countries and states are resolved via diplomacy, negotiation, but never again with force. Putin and Russia have put an end to that. And also, I think for this foreseeable time, put an end to the belief that we can build a cooperative relationship with Russia. NATO has proven its worth, and it has done so against the background of deep skepticism as to whether NATO would indeed stand up to such an aggression. Just remember, it was only in the summer of 2021 that NATO just fled in many ways from Afghanistan. A disastrous performance. And we know from some evidence that Putin's decision to actually start the war in February was in part linked to an assessment what that meant as far as NATO's resilience is concerned. We have that show of unity and forceful diplomatic response on NATO's side. But we also had the prospect that Donald Trump might be back in the White House in 2024, with all the implication that that has for how we, in Germany, in other European capitals, and in part, of course, in Washington, plan for the years ahead. This is a novel element. I think many in European capitals think they can no longer rely on the US standing on our side for the indefinite future when it comes to critical events such as the war in Ukraine. In that sense, continued Western success and cohesion that has become clear during the last few months depends on close coordination between the US and European allies, And I think that has also sunk in, at least in terms of a perception in European capitals, that the Europeans have to come to terms with providing for their own defense. The necessary decisions have not yet been taken, and it will be hard, but the realization that that is a key task is there. Expectations vis-à-vis Germany have risen, and trust in German leadership remains high overall, yet it has also suffered. And I will come now to a few fairly recent public opinion data that highlight that dimension of how Europeans relate to Germany and how Germans see their own leadership role, because that in many ways brings to point the critical challenges that Germany faces in taking up that more visible leadership role, including the military field. Again, I'm showing you a few highlights from recent surveys in the European context. The Transatlantic Trends 2022 just came out yesterday, and one of the questions in that really very readable report of survey results was which 3 European countries are the most influential in Europe. So just measuring influence. What you have here, of course, is you have Germany ranking in the assessment of all European states clearly ahead as the most influential European country. That applies to essentially all states, how they judge Germany. Only French think that France is a bit more important and influential than Germany. Everybody else, including the Brits, 63% of the Brits think that it's the UK, but 68% think it's Germany that is the most influential country. So you have a clear ranking here, how Germany is perceived in terms of influence. When it comes to reliability as partner, Germans can still also draw on that kind of support and perceptions among its partners. There is a lot of trust. 70% of Germany's allies think that it is a reliable partner. Fairly ahead of a few others who might be playing in that same league. Yet, what is important to note also, these are data that came out just yesterday. In comparison to last year, perceptions of reliability have been decreasing in some countries significantly. Poland, for instance, it's only 53% who today believe that Germany is a reliable partner, minus 15%, and also in the US. The Americans believe that Germany is no longer as reliable as it used to be. So as a result, I would guess, of how Germany performed in the Ukraine crisis, this kind of trust in Germany has been suffering. When you look at Europeans in particular, this is a survey that the ECFR, the European Council on Foreign Relations, did a year ago, before the last German elections, how Europeans assess Germans. One of the questions was if there was an election for the president of Europe, and the only 2 candidates were Emmanuel Macron or Angela Merkel, who would you vote for? And it's, I mean, I found it a bit astounding how clearly Merkel outranks Macron. I mean, here in the Netherlands, 58% of Dutch felt that they would vote for her. Only 6 would have voted for Macron. Of course, even when you go down to France, even 32% of the French would have voted for Merkel, and only 20 for Macron. So that is a personalized form of trust, but it, of course, in some ways also relates to Germany. This is the nice picture, but but now is the more ambivalent data that sheds a bit of different light on how Europeans and Germans themselves see their own role. The question whether Germany's golden age is a thing of the past, present, or still to come had also been put to European citizens. And interestingly here, the Germans and the Austrians in particular felt that the golden age is past. Germany's golden age is past. Very few Germans and Austrians think that the best time of the Germans is either today or still ahead. This changes a little bit when you go down. Spain and a few others. I mean, the Dutch are, again, fairly realistic in their assessment, I believe, both in terms of the balance between, it's a thing of the past, but they're present, and a lot of people here, of course, most actually in the whole survey, who didn't want to put it in those terms. Overall, the assessment here is Germany is a declining power, more than a rising one. And that, of course, is significant when you think about possible leadership roles for Germany. It's still more difficult if you look at European trust in German leadership when it comes to Germany's ability to handle EU relations with other great powers. The Dutch, again, are fairly optimistic here. But when you come down to the French, the Poles, the Italians, for instance, especially in terms of handling relations with the US, but even more so with Russia and China, the Germans are not sufficiently trusted to have the skill, talent, and power to deal with that. You combine in this question optimism about German decline or rise with trust in Berlin's capacity to lead. And what you find, this is especially here, I mean, between 20 and 25% of those who think that Germany is more a declining power don't believe that the Germans are good at handling defense, security, relations with the US, Russia, and China. This is a pretty sobering kind of result. One quarter of Europeans believe Germany has the power to lead in these critical instances. And of course, these are the critical instances we are facing today. This one is also, I thought, quite interesting. Germany's nationalism or Germany's European orientation, where Germans believe that they are not really turning more nationalistic. 36% of Germans think that they will become more focused on helping other Europeans, but the perception in other European countries is different. There is an expectation that Germany will turn more nationalistic and be less European. Finally, as far as this survey is concerned, Germans' own confidence in their leadership capabilities. Over here, Germans are even less positive, optimistic about being able to handle defense in a European context. So what you have here is a fairly mixed picture. On the one hand, you have a lot of trust in Germany of playing some kind of leadership role in a European context. But when it comes to the hard issues, I mean, those who are actually topical today when we look at European relations in a Ukrainian context, the picture is quite different. I have a few more data on Ukraine in particular, just to highlight how Germans are not that different from other European or NATO ally partners when it comes to taking in large numbers of Ukrainian refugees. This is fairly high. in a European intra-alliance comparison when it comes to banning imports of oil and gas. Perhaps not surprisingly, the German support is still in a solid majority, but lower than in other countries, given the situation that we are all familiar with, dependence on Russian gas. Still, I think somewhat stunning, 59% of Germans and more than French want to increase military supplies and equipment to Ukraine. So there is more support in Germany for helping Ukraine militarily than in France. And less surprising, a solid support when it comes to the possibility of Ukrainian membership in the European Union. All right. Now, what does that lead us to? Thank you. What does that lead us to when we come to assess the current situation and the outlook? In a sense, one can argue, I think, that German leadership in Europe is ever more in demand. But it is also, as I think these data show, and when you look and talk to people in Berlin and other places, it resonates also in elite circles. It is also highly ambivalent. I think if one looks at how Germany's political class has developed over the last 10 to 15 years, it has come to increasingly accept a leadership role. And that also applies to the Social Democrats, who have been most hesitant when it comes to the military side. Lambrecht, the defense minister, Lars Klingbeil, the SPD Vorsitzende, they have all recently in speeches emphasized that Germany is willing and has to take a military leadership role as well in a European context. To what that actually boils down to, the how, is still, of course, an open and debated question. Now, success in leading, Germany leading in a European context, depends, of course, on willing followership. And that cannot be taken for granted, no longer. Or no, as in the past, because of course Germany comes with a certain package historically, but also as far as its position of power in a European context is concerned, which means that consensus building within the European Union and as far as the critical base for Germany's global involvement is concerned remains the best bet. Working with European partners to build some form of consensus in order to operate in a coordinated European way, EU-European way in the global context. That is the task. But that, of course, also means that the demands on German diplomatic skill, given the fact that there are hugely different expectations, say in Poland or in the Baltic republics compared to Spain and Portugal, are immense. The strategic environment in which Germany will have to operate beyond the EU will also be ever less conducive to the traditional German foreign policy tools and practices. You all know these debates that we have in Brussels these days about the Europeans having to become more realpolitik, like in their diplomatic and foreign policy practices. Yet I think to that extent that these kinds of tools are required, that heightens the risk that followership, especially in a European context, will be more difficult to mobilize if the Germans take that kind of lead. So we have countervailing pressures. On the one hand, there is a need to be more realpolitik-like, but to the extent that Germany would actually engage in those kind of practices, you would probably face instant opposition from different quarters within the European Union in particular. This is my last slide, and this is big strokes now. And what I'm trying to do in a few spots here is to just sketch the new strategic environment that I think Germans and Europeans have to operate in, to just underline the difficulty and challenges that we are facing, and that Germans in particular are facing when they are looking at the future. I think one good way to think about the global landscape these days is to imagine it as a strategic rectangle. We have 4 big players: China, the US, Russia, and the European Union, which relate to each other critically as significant others in all cases. So you have different types of bilateral relationships that shape the strategic rectangle. Changes in one bilateral relationship will affect the rectangle as a whole and other bilateral relationships. And what is significant, I think, is that the dynamics of that kind of constellation is different from the old Cold War. In the Cold War, you have bipolarity, where it's fairly clear what centers of power matter. It's the US and the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact and NATO, 2 blocks. The periphery, I mean, the non-aligned countries, I mean, Japan, China even in those days, didn't really matter for the global strategic calculation of power, which meant that, I mean, Japan could just be sidelined in many ways. I mean, when it came to the big lines of power, compared to today, where, of course, 4 major players interacting in a global relationship will cause effects if they change their behavior. And there have been discussions a year ago or so, especially among Europeans, whether we should follow the US in confronting China as radically as the US under Trump, but also starting with Biden, was pushing. There was skepticism then, but given the fact that Russia's war in Ukraine has heightened what I would call bipolarization in this rectangle, that is China and Russia being forced together, and of course the US and the EU again being bound to each other in a deeper fashion, that has affected the relationship in that rectangle in a fashion that is actually of interest to very few besides Russia. Actually, I would argue none. Neither Chinese, nor the Europeans, nor the Americans have an interest in that kind of bipolarization. A year ago, I wrote an article with Charles Kupchan, a colleague from the US who was also working for the Obama administration, where we were arguing, that was well before the escalation, that the Europeans and the Americans would have to look at recreating a relationship with Russia. It was already difficult at that point to make that kind of argument, that it would be essential for us, with a view to China, to try to come to some kind of modus vivendi with Putin. I think in the long term, that actually must be the aim, both strategically, but also politically, in terms of Russia being, for us, a more significant neighbor in many ways than China. And building, I mean, trying to build in the very long term. I'm not speaking about the next 5 or 10 years. Trying to rebuild a kind of relationship with Russia would be essential for peace in Europe, but also for the well-being of Europe and for us in the European Union. The prospect of Donald Trump returning to the White House, I mentioned that already, will heighten those strategic challenges for Germany in particular and the EU. Yet, irrespective of what Russia does, I think we as Europeans ought to take into account that even the Biden administration has other plans than being the predominant Western power in a European concert of powers. Biden began his administration with saying there are 3 aims: is China, China, China. Actually emphasizing that besides his foreign policy for a middle class, a focus on domestic politics, the major foreign policy challenge for the US would be China. Putin and Russia have undermined that kind of ambition, but strategically in the medium and long term, the Americans will come back to that, irrespective of whether Trump wins or not. And that means that the Europeans, and in that sense also Germany, playing a critical role in the European context, will have to come to terms with what that means for us. Maintaining close coordination between the US and EU remains critical and ever more challenging. In many ways, this is what we say in Germany, Binsenweisheit. But I think it's necessary to underline that because it's really critical at this point in time, not only for keeping a joint position vis-à-vis Russia, but also when you look at the dynamics of intra-European politics and Germany's role in intra-European politics. We used to say in the old times that the American presence in Europe had a pacifier function. That is, helping that the Europeans don't mess up. They fall back into a warlike situation. To the extent that the Americans withdraw from a European context, that of course heightens Germany's power. The fact that the Brits are out of the European Union also makes life a bit more difficult, I would argue, because to the extent that the Franco-German relationship as a bilateral one, the central one in many ways still, but much less significant overall, given the size of the European Union, that puts a lot of pressure on Germany in particular, because on the one hand, expectations to lead are rising, but sensitivities as far as the balance of power is concerned are rising as well. So you have a dilemma here in many ways, which will be the key issue, one of the key issues for Germany to face in the next few years, besides the fact that, of course, the world in many ways looks like a place that will leave a lot more trouble even compared to today. I'm looking forward to your comments and questions. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Gunther, for a very inspiring lecture and for sharing very recently published public opinion and data as well. The floor is now open. We have another almost 40 minutes for discussion before we have to clear this venue again. And by the way, this is being live streamed, which means that in order to take questions, you kindly offer to walk around with a microphone. So if you have questions, please raise your hand and someone will walk by with a microphone. Who wants to go first? Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. You described how both within Germany as well as from its allies, there's more of an expectation for Germany to take a greater responsibility in terms of foreign policy. Does this only apply to sort of, let's say, the backyard, so Russia and sort of the immediate threats and problems, or also, for example, to Africa, the Middle East, global terrorism? Is it only a very local thing where Germany should or could be more assertive and more responsible, or is it more global?
Well, I think if you ask people in Paris, in Washington, and a few other places, I mean, those partners in the European or NATO context that have global ambitions themselves, you will find them often saying, yes, of course, not only locally or regionally in a European context, but also globally. And Mali is a case in point. The French have been withdrawing. The Germans are still there, but they are really currently debating. One of my just recently graduated doctoral students is now based in the German embassy in Bamako. And what he's telling me is that there's a lot of pressure, especially among the Social Democrats, to cut down based on the deteriorating situation in Mali. So, and when the Americans, he's saying, just met him on Monday, the Americans have a strong presence in Mali, for instance, but they're not really visible. They want the Germans to play that kind of game, so they show their global presence, but they're not in the lead. They will put out brakes when they think things are not going in the right direction. But the French and the Americans are in the back, and the Germans, at this point at least, who knows for how long, are in the lead. And in that sense, of course, the expectation is that Germany is not only, but given the fact that the main trouble at this point in time is regionally in a European context. And we have not been talking yet about intra-EU European problems that we face collectively. I mean, post-corona funding. Italy has a new government. How do we go about actually funding today's decision in Brussels? How do we go about the energy prices? And of course, in many ways, European partners are expecting the Germans to carry the burden in a stronger fashion than others, given the fact that it should be in a position to do so a bit more easier than others. So in that sense, I think when you come to European partners, besides, say, France, the US, etc., the preoccupation is, of course, primarily in the regional context and not so much in a global context. But others, such as the US and France, have other interests as well that reach globally.
Thanks. And there's the question from Gert.
Yes. Hello. Thank you very much for your talk. I was quite surprised to have a talk about foreign policy of Germany without a focus on energy politics. And my big question about German foreign policy is that we have had a history where Russia has become increasingly aggressive over a long period of time. I mean, we can go back to the annexation of South Ossetia and Georgia, for example. All of these events have basically not deterred the détente policy towards Russia. And currently we are seeing a moment in time where we are changing our energy politics, and now, of course, we are forced to abandon this dependence on Russia. But it does kind of question, how is it possible that this has come at such a late stage? And what responsibility does Germany have for this policy remaining in place for so long? And to this extent as well, because there would have been many moments in history where there would have been a choice to limit dependence on Russia, I would argue. So I'm curious, do you see any of those moments in history that choice could have been made but hasn't been made? Thank you very much.
Well, good points, and well taken in terms of also looking at the situation right now and looking back, what should have been done possibly earlier. I think by now, there's almost nobody left in the German political class that says we have been doing the right thing and we should have continued that. So by now, Steinmeier, Gabriel, and all the others are realizing and publicly confessing that in many ways our partners, Poles among others, have been right all along in warning us. It's not the case that in Germany it was a uniform position to say we have to keep energy links with Russia. There are some politicians in the CDU, not the majority, at least not under Merkel. And of course, many among the Greens who have been arguing in favor of stopping that kind of dependency on Russia much earlier, not expanding Nord Stream 2, for instance. And the fact that, I mean, this whole issue has always been to some extent puzzling for myself, because even though you might say, well, there's a long history dating back to the 60s and 70s where Erdgasröhrengeschäfte, as they were told, they were called, have been established with Russia, with the Soviet Union, and have succeeded in helping even, I mean, that is often one of the arguments, even in the old, harsh Cold War days, that kind of dimension of our cooperative relationship had been safe. The Russians had to sell their energy, and we were willing receivers, buyers hoping that those kinds of links might also help to stabilize relations in some fashion. I think that, I mean, there's a specific history. Gerhard Schröder, the way that he finalized Nord Stream 1 in the last few days of his chancellorship, path dependencies with Merkel being stuck in some fashion, but also subscribing to that kind of program, given that he was coalescing with the Social Democrats. And the not to be underestimated German business lobby that had strong economic links and political ties with Russia over the years. So there was a lobby. And from a, you might say, a purely realist point of view, you could make an argument why it might also be helpful to have a direct link to Russia and not depend on Poles, Ukrainians, etc., for land lines. So in that sense, having additional options made strategic sense to some extent. But of course, in hindsight today, you're right. And nobody would dispute that today. We should have stopped that earlier. We should have clearly reduced dependencies of that sort much earlier, because now, of course, we are stuck. Not only us as Germans, but also many of our EU partners in a kind of difficult relationship due to that kind of dependence.
Yes, please.
And please, you're right. I mean, I've been skipping over a lot of important, detailed, specific questions. Feel free to ask those questions, because I've been trying to give you a broader picture first. We can speak exactly about those specific issues.
Hello, I was wondering, could you briefly describe the developing ideas within the major parties on how Germany should take up its new role? So, and what are the main differences?
I think that by now, as far as the mainstream parties are concerned, and by mainstream I mean starting with the CDU, CSU on the right, Free Democrats in many ways are not as left anymore as they used to be. They are in a similar spectrum. The Greens and the Social Democrats. There is still a fairly huge consensus, I think, with graded differences as far as the necessity of accepting a certain kind of leadership role, both politically, classically, when it comes to economics in a European context, but also now increasingly, as I have briefly hinted at, in terms of military leadership role. We have discussions here and there to what extent Germany might have to go nuclear. I've been always a very skeptic when it comes to that, because there are good reasons, I would argue, why in that regard there is a certain division of labor and mutual dependency, for instance, when it comes to the French nuclear power. The fact that the French are a nuclear power in that sense, that the Germans need not and must not become in order not to erase any kind of power differentials between those two critical actors. It will be difficult anyhow. I mean, with Macron, until the recent elections, we had the best possible Franco-German constellation one could imagine. Just recall, there was a possibility that in early 2017, Le Pen might have won against Macron. And that was a nightmare in Berlin. I remember talking to people in Berlin saying, well, we have Brexit, we have Trump, and we might have Le Pen. I mean, this would have been the end in many ways for how the European Union project worked. So in that sense, there's a huge consensus, I think, by now, when it comes to accepting that kind of leadership role. When you look at the AfD on the right and the Linke on the left, there are, of course, differences. I mean, the AfD has classically been pro-Russia. I mean, Gauland has been fixated on Bismarck and a pro-Russia priority orientation for a long time. And the AfD, I mean, there are rumors that they are also getting some funding from Russia, Russian sources. You see them popping up in election observer roles in Russia, etc., fake roles in Crimea. So the AfD is an outcast in many ways, and it doesn't really matter a lot in terms of foreign policy. The left, Die Linke, is by now, I think, the only one on the left, besides a few individuals among the Social Democrats, who is, outright propagating a pacifist kind of position. So that doesn't mean taking over some leadership role in, say, social politics in the European Union, but not as far as the military is concerned. They had to tone down their pro-Russia rhetoric since Putin's invasion in Ukraine. And in that regard, interestingly, I mean, the AfD and the Linke had a few similar positions when it came to excuse some of the political positionings by Putin himself. So in that sense, these are outliers in many ways. There are differences, and this will, I think, become more critical for the European Union between, say, harsh liberal, neoliberal FDP politicians who want to just cut down on spending, including the kind of subsidies and support in a European context to handle Corona and other crises. That will become a much more important dividing line in the German political class, and it puts the Liberals, some CDU members on the one hand, against the Greens, Social Democrats, and those who would be willing to go a bit farther in order to address some of the expectations in Paris, for instance, that there might be an economic governance structure at the European Union level at some point in order to further limit German power when it comes to those kinds of decisions. Does that help?
Maybe to follow up quickly on that, what I more meant is, do they have an idea within the parties, or are they developing that still, what they want to do, except for, of course, the national defense for Germany, but with regards to maybe tensions in Asia, maybe terrorism in Africa, policing the Balkan. There are, of course, a number of things you might be able to do, or roles you could take up in conflict areas that before were always left to mostly Americans and then a little bit of support, and that you now can take up.
Well, I think in my analysis, what you observe in almost all European NATO/EU capitals is a certain sobering effect after the Afghanistan experience. And the French withdrawing from Mali is another indication where one of the lessons, broader lessons to be drawn in almost all European capitals is these kinds of engagements are highly sensitive. They need a sustained effort over decades. And increasingly, publics are unwilling to support those kinds of initiatives. I don't see much differences here as far as German political parties is concerned. When it comes to global politics, I think one of the critical differences, of course, is when it comes to the Anthropocene, climate policy, where the Greens would be pushing much farther ahead and more rigidly than, say, the Christian Democrats or the Free Democrats. And to some extent also the Social Democrats. But that is not the kind of, I guess you were mostly looking at strategic military types of issues. On terrorism, I don't see much difference. But again, I must also confess that I have not looked recently at the party programs in particular in order to detect those kinds of similarities and differences.
Yeah, there's a question over there.
Okay, Okay, let's test this. Okay, it works. Well, thank you for your contribution and for your talk this afternoon. I was wondering if you can reflect a bit more on the term of Zeitenwende. I think you were a bit critical on Scholz using the term, actually, because you were referring to the history on Germany, and there were some earth-moving moments they already have experienced. And I heard a bit of a statement underlined by you that it wasn't really that of a Zeitenwende if you compare it with the others. So could you reflect on using the term, and would you also perhaps think that there's an inflation of the word using Zeitenwende? And is it something that also perhaps has to do with the fact that we use the word crisis a lot nowadays? So everything is a crisis. At this moment, I have a crisis at my home, for instance, for dinner. I mean, so perhaps you can also reflect on using the word crisis. And I have another different, smaller question about China and Germany. You gave some examples of how people think that Germany would act and relate to China, and also trying to help out the benefits for other UP members, for instance. And they were a bit skeptical. They were not positive about the possibility Germany has to do so. You referred to capacities and so on. I actually was wondering if this also has to do with the fact that they think that Germany perhaps has the capacities, but is also thinking about its own profits and firms, and will definitely not take the greater benefit with it, that their own stakes also will prevail in the end. So perhaps you can also say some 2 or 3 words about that. Thank you very much.
Well, recently I read an essay where the author said, I mean, along the lines that you argued, the use of crisis is in crisis. In the sense, of course, of saying, underlying the same kind of argument you were putting forward, that is, we are, for whatever reason, inflating the uses of certain terms, which I think in some cases is perhaps more easily explainable than in others. I mean, the crisis concept has been with us for a long time, and I think in many ways, I mean, I would even say there is some legitimacy to argue today that we see a proliferation of crises. And I think really that the crisis term, I would say, is justified when we look especially at the complexities of crises increasingly being interwoven and interacting. I mean, you see, Ukraine and the wheat price in Africa. I mean, who would have thought, I mean, here in the room, that there is such a strong linkage here? So you look at many different kinds of dimensions. I mean, the climate change and what that does to us in our daily life. The fact that the water level in the Rhine was so low in the summer that shipping lanes and deliveries, critical deliveries for the industry were no longer possible. Prices rising as a result. So you see these kinds of linkages increasingly where you can argue that the effects that they have on our daily lives are indeed of such an extent that the crisis concept would be justifiable, and not only in the classical sense of a singular, isolatable kind of crisis, but of a complex of crises, of interlinked relations. Zeitenwende, I would indeed argue that rhetorically, I mean, Scholz, of course, had reason why he emphasized that term. I mean, as a social democrat, I hinted at that, coming out and saying, I mean, to this astonishment of all observers, that we will put an extra 100 billion safeguarded by the German basic law. It's not just, this is not a Haushaltstitel. This is a big amount of money that is guaranteed in the German basic law, in the Grundgesetz, to be spent on the Bundeswehr. For a German chancellor to come out with that kind of figure would have been unimaginable in January. So for him to use the Zeitenwende notion in characterizing what Putin has been doing, of course, is a political rhetorical move that also helps to justify what he has been arguing politically, the 100 billion Sondervermögen. So there is a political linkage here why I'm using certain terms in order to justify political decisions. As you say, and I'm glad that that message came across, in terms of a comparison in a longer historical line, it is a fairly minuscule kind of change when it comes to German foreign policy. I mean, the situation has changed significantly, I would say, but compared to, say, 71, 80, 70, 80, 71, 1990, 1949, 1945, 1990, it is much less of a significant event, and that was also critical to my kind of argument. It's not something that Germany has been pushing for or forcing upon others. It's being forced in many ways on Germans, and Germans in many ways don't like it. I mean, the days when surveys in Germany done that the image of the ideal world in the future for Germans would be Switzerland. So what kind of world would we want to live in, and in what kind of way would you want to live in that world? Switzerland. That was the image in the early 90s. Surveys showed that. We wanted to be a big Switzerland. I mean, no troubles from the world affecting our lives, and nice mountains, and enjoy life and wealth, of course. I mean, those days are gone. But Germans are not really keen, broadly speaking, I mean, for the kinds of leadership roles in the military field. I mean, they are increasingly ready to accept that. I mean, and those numbers as far as Ukrainian support in terms of military supplies, I mean, underline that. But that kind of support is also, compared to the early days, a bit weakening these days. And we'll see where we stand in half a year from now or a year from now. China. Yes, of course. I mean, there are German firms that are pushing for and keep an interest in keeping that economic relationship stable. I think I'm not an expert in either China or Russia, but my sense from speaking to people is that the pro-Russia lobby in the German business community was much stronger than the pro-China lobby in the business field. And I think, given the fact that the Chinese are, of course, a different sort of competitor, that they are copying, stealing from German firms, which, I mean, Russia was not a real satisfying and satisfaktionsfähig, as we say in German, economic business partner. So it benefited the German side. I mean, that is much more difficult compared to China. So the German business community, given the political restrictions they are operating under in China, increasingly also accept political leadership in many ways. The numbers that I've been referring to were to a large extent both European numbers, I mean the surveys, Europeans being skeptical whether Germany is capable to handle, and Germans, you're right, Germans being even more skeptical when it comes to that. In part, I think it has to do with Germans not really being keen to play that kind of global Weltpolitik great power role. I mean, if we can avoid that, that's nice. If we have to do it, well, we'll try to do it as good as we can, but not necessarily on the terms that the French or the US might prefer.
Yes, there's a question in the middle.
How would you explain that Germans think they are not becoming more nationalistic, while other European countries do think Germans are becoming more nationalistic?
Well, I think the self-images and the images of others seldom coincide. I mean, one of those transatlantic trend results was that, of course, you see a clear line that countries always overestimate their influence in the European setting. So all the rest would rank Turkey much lower than Turks themselves. But that applies to all the other European countries in that survey as well. I think Germans would indeed fancy themselves as not being nationalistic. I think, well, probably if you were to conduct a global survey, I mean, quite a few would probably agree that in comparative terms, probably Germans are less nationalistic than the average. So in that sense, fancying oneself as being more European rather than nationalistic is quite expectable. On the other side, the much bigger hesitation among European partners as far as German nationalism and pro-European orientation is concerned, of course, is also to be explained by reference to specific concerns that these countries have. I mean, we've been talking with one colleague before about Radosław Sikorski's, the former Polish minister's quote from, I think, about 10 years ago when he said in a speech in Berlin, "I'm standing here today as the Polish foreign minister," and roughly it goes like, and calling upon you to take a lead in European affairs. That was more than 10 years ago. And he added that for me as a Polish foreign minister, being in Berlin and making that kind of demand on you is probably surprising and not heard of. And indeed it was. But I think one of the implications of that was and he added, and that was never really much quoted, "If you listen to us, we will follow you." And of course, you have all kinds of demands when you look at it from Berlin, from different kinds of partners. You have the Balts, you have the Portuguese, you have the Spaniards, you have the Swedes, with specific requests as far as what Germany should do. And positively answering all of them is not possible because they are going to very different directions. So that kind of difference also explains why German nationalism, in the sense of them not following our line or preferences, is a bit more of a worry in European capitals than in Berlin, and why these EU members, based in part on their own experience. I mean, if you are building consensus in Brussels, that means that others will not get what they ideally want. That they have been the victims, you might say, in many ways, of these kinds of compromises based on what they actually preferred for Germans to work for. That would, I think, be my explanation for the difference between European and German perceptions of nationalism.
I think we have time for one more question. And if there's none from the audience, I would maybe post one. Oh yeah, there's one from the audience. Okay, please.
I wondered if you have, I just read a summary of Putin's speech today with the annexation of the 4 republics in Ukraine, and it was a pretty terrifying speech. And one of the things he says is that Germany is an occupied country by the United States. I don't know if you've read the speech or summary, but it's pretty scary stuff. And I was wondering if you could comment, at least on that comment. He says that he's basically, if I understand correctly the translation I read, that this is not about Ukraine, this is about countering the colonial imperialistic West. And Germany, South Korea, Japan are all occupied by the United States. How do you, as a German, see dealing with this type of rhetoric? At least I hope it's just rhetoric. Thank you. Well,
unfortunately, I've already heard that Putin gave that speech today, but I have not had the time since I've been traveling, etc., to actually follow that. I mean, my initial reaction would be I wouldn't take that seriously. I mean, Well, I mean, he's using all kinds of rhetorical tools these days, and if he's saying that, I mean, I would agree when he says we will possibly also use our whole spectrum of military weapons if NATO does X and Y. I would indeed, Merkel said that a few days ago, I would indeed not believe that this is a bluff. I mean, Putin is to be taken seriously when he's threatening to walk up the escalation ladder. But calling Germany an occupied country by US imperialists, I mean, it sounds like propaganda in the old days. I mean, if that has the implication, I mean, I'm just thinking about what could that mean in terms of practical consequences. If that would have the implication that he would sort of declare German territory as a legitimate target because it's occupied by the US imperialists, of course, that would bring in a different kind of message. And I would not take that in that sense not seriously. But in terms of, so the political consequences of that kind of statement are to be taken seriously. But in terms of a description of what is the fact, of course, this is a different kind of matter. Please. If
I can follow on. But the problem is that has traction in Latin America, Asia, Africa. You mentioned Bamako. So it's a big issue that, and the Germans, as an occupied country, between how they're going to deal with that. There's got to be some kind of a soft power answer to that, if I can put it that way. But also, it's a tough chess game you're playing now.
Well, I wouldn't see. I wouldn't see at this moment how and why Germany should respond with a hard power answer to that kind of rhetoric. I mean, it has to be made clear.
I said soft power. I said soft power. I didn't say hard power.
Okay, but I think it's both soft and hard.
I meant soft. Sorry.
In terms of, I mean, of course, and I think Scholz, for all his hesitation and really bad communication when it came to what extent Germany would be willing to support Ukraine, what kinds of weapons we would be willing to deliver, for all of that, I mean, the basic line that he has been preaching from the beginning, I think, is sound, and it is followed by a majority of Germans, I believe. It's a steadfast position, and I think this kind of statement that he's making in terms of standing at the side of Ukraine, continuing supplying weapons, not necessarily the kinds that all Ukrainians want, but there are also some reasons why the Germans are a bit more hesitant in that regard. That Scholz and Baerbock and others will come out with a clear statement that this is unacceptable, and that we will not let us being pushed maybe into a corner where we stop doing these things. I mean, this is always fine lines. I mean, what kinds of, I mean, do you deliver Leopard 1 tanks to Ukraine, or do you leave it with Leopard 1 or what have you? I mean, these are, of course, also signalings in an exchange where the escalation question is always in the back. My sense is that the mobilization is going really bad for Putin. So he, even in response to that measure that is supposed to counter the losses, I mean, he is seeing that he's not achieving what he is aiming for. In that sense, I mean, he is probably building also a threatening posture where I think his problem is that he might put himself ever more into the corner where he might in the end have to use weapons which he really wouldn't want to use in the first place, because he has put himself under pressure not to be bluffing. I mean, that is a real danger, and I think the kind of reasoning that has been going on in Western capitals in acting united and decidedly is the right thing. Not shying back, but also not pushing forward in a manner that might risk that kind of escalation.
think we could go on for a while, since these are the obviously big questions of today and in our time. But I suggest that we leave it here, because also we have to leave the venue again. So let me thank all of you for coming out this afternoon, for attending this talk. And let me especially thank Gunther Hellmann for coming here, and yeah, for his very engaged and interesting input and talk today. Thank you.